All right, guys, we are back again. We have on camera for you here our second coverage round of Modern. We have on your left Chris, who is on Affinity, like usual, and Dan, who is on Abzan, like usual. So, if you're a fan of Dan, you can cheer out here. If you're not a fan of Dan, feel free to, I don't know, flame me if you'd like. All right, we'll go over our big screen here. So, Abzan and Affinity. This is not the best matchup for Affinity. Abzan has a lot of removal that fights it well. Hello, Tuna Pack. It is good to see you again, sir. I appreciate you coming to join me for some Modern tonight. There is going to be another round after this still, so underway we go here. Affinity starting off with a Blinkmoth Nexus, a Mox Opal, and a Volt Scourge, paying 2 life. So Chris is down to 18. The Mox Opal is currently not active. He does only have the 2 artifacts in play. Blossoming or Blooming Marsh, Blossoming, what the Marsh card, whatever it's called, I can't remember now. Inquisition takes out an Etched Champion. And that's a very good choice, seeing as how that is a hard card for this deck to answer. Still no 3rd artifact, as he just has an Inkmoth Nexus. So Mox Opal is still not doing anything for him, other than being a 2nd artifact. And a pass of the turn back. Dan just has land go. There is another Etched Champion from Chris. 3 artifacts now in play. So Metalcraft is turned on, and that, of course, is the most important for Etched Champion. Dan, now, I mean, this is, if Dan is able to remove the Volt Scourge, or even the Mox Opal, he then has a window to deal with this Etched Champion. And again, Etched Champion is not the easiest card for Abzan to deal with. So if he's able to take it out immediately, that's going to be a very strong start for him. Or a very, very good play. So Dan, fetching and shocking. Down to 16, I believe. True as well, yes. It's pointed out that, yes, Chris is able, of course, to turn on a land to turn his Metalcraft back on. Again, if Dan were able to take care of that Volt Scourge on the attack, which I think we're still in the process of, he would be able to... There would be an opening for it to still turn on Metalcraft, so... Or turn off Metalcraft for the time being. Doesn't look like Dan has an answer, however. Looks like he's just taking the damage here. Has a copy of Path to Exile in hand. Which it looks like he is going to go ahead and fire off. And it looks like there is a Liliana. Now I believe Chris went ahead and floated a mana here before the Volt Scourge went away. Now, I mean, being in... I'm not sure if that was end step or when that was done. If it was end step, I mean, he could have floated red to Galvanic Blast, something like that. Yeah, looks like it was the end step. There's Liana to take care of the Etched Champion. Chris going to be able to answer Liana relatively easy here, of course, with Blinkmoth Nexus and Inkmoth Nexus. So Not gonna last long as Liana unless Chris doesn't care about her. Also possible. There is a Darksteel Citadel for Chris, so that's going to be another artifact in play for him. Still only has 2, so currently Opal, again, not making mana right now. However, if he does turn on one of his creature lands, that will turn on his Metalcraft again. Sure enough, Liliana goes down, and there we see a Master of Ethereum. So we'll get that one pulled up on screen. Increases the power toughness of all his current artifact creatures, other artifact creatures by +1/+1, and he himself has power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts under your control. So right now the Master is a 3/3. Tarmogoyf is a 6/7 though. So that one quickly outclassing the Master. Chris with 2 cards in hand. Dan's done a good job of kind of slowing down Chris, which is really what you need to do against Affinity. Chris, thinking about his options here, he is able to turn on both his lands. That would in turn make the Master a 5/5, have both his land be 2/2 flyers. Okay, a second Master, sure. So now has 4 artifacts, plus they're increasing each other. Those are 5/5 Masters. And if he turns on Blink Moth, it'll be a 3/3. And the Masters will go to 6/6s. However, Tarmogoyf still bigger than those. So Chris has drawn a lot of his 3-drops this game, which is kind of an awkward spot for Affinity to be in, as it doesn't really have a way to deal with all that. So it doesn't usually have enough mana to play multiple 3-drops in one turn. So kind of awkward, but we'll see what Chris can do. Dan playing a Lingering Souls, and it looks like, yeah, not flashing it back. So just plays a Lingering Souls, gets himself a couple blockers. Definitely not a bad card against Affinity. Affinity not great at getting trample, so 1/1 creatures do a lot. Here we see the attack from both manlands, both Masters. So at the moment, the Masters are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 artifacts in play, plus their own boost to each other. So they are 7/7 Masters, and we have a 3/3 Blink Moth and a 3/3 Ink Moth. So Dan's just going to go ahead. Dan's going to take the 3 poison, and he takes 3 more as well from the Ink Moth. Or Blink Moth, rather, sorry. And then Chris passes the turn back. So Dan's going to be able to put up 2 more flying blockers thanks to that Lingering Souls being flashed back. Which is what we see there. He has an Anafenza in hand, and I'm not too sure what the other card is. I think it's a Collective Brutality. However, it's an Overgrown Tomb. So that's not doing anything. I mean, he's going to play Anafenza, so she's a 4/4 body, which is good. Goyf did swing in for 6, which is also a huge chunk. So Chris down to 13 as well. Chris going to take a read of Anafenza. We'll do the same. Anafenza the foremost. How do you... There we go. Inoffensive the Foremost. Whenever Inoffensive the Foremost attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target or another target tapped creature you control. And if a creature is put into a graveyard from an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you exile instead. So really fights graveyard synergies, helps bolster the power of other attackers. Dan unfortunately has to concede this game as showing Chris, I just drew a whole lot of lands. So that does happen sometimes. It is, of course, unfortunate for Dan. However, it's Magic, so that is what happens sometimes. So we're going to go to a game 2. Chris is up a game. So going into the sideboards, Dan on Abzan is really just going to want, if he has more removal to bring into from the sideboard, he wants to bring those in for sure. Chris can bring in things like Nihil Spellbomb. I don't think he is, but he is. That's a choice you have for sure. It looks like he's looking at Spell Pierce, which are good. Whip Flare I don't think is very good. Spell Pierce could be okay. Looks like he's bringing in Wear and Tear. I don't think that's going to be very useful for him. Wear and Tear doesn't do a whole lot for against Dan's deck. Now it's possible he's bringing it in preemptively, as Dan does have access to things like Stony Silence, which of course are very strong cards against Chris. So yeah, I mean, Dan's surely going to bring in Stony Silence. There's probably no question about that. This is the match you have it for, so why would you not? Again, may just be preemptively, hedging against some sideboard cards from Dan. So, which totally reasonable. Not not a bad idea, to say the least. So, is a way to ensure that you are safe if Dan just happens to draw it naturally, which is very possible. I have been found a lovely counterspell. If anyone that heard that was Martin chiming in, letting me know I've got myself a nice shiny new counterspell. So players presenting here for game 2. Dan will be on the play, so he's going to want to see his turn 1 hand disruption, whether it be Thoughtseize or Inquisition of Kozilek. Kozilek, both very good against Affinity. Affinity is a very low-cost deck, so very, very effective card, Inquisition of Kozilek. So we'll see exactly what he has. It looks like he does have a copy of that Inquisition of Kozilek. He also has a copy of his sideboard Damnation. So that is another very important card in this matchup. Especially having in his opening hand, he knows that assuming he can get to 4 mana, he's going to be safe in terms of creatures, as he is able to then just wipe the board. So starts on a Shambling Vent, Chris starting on Memnite, Inkmoth Nexus, Vault Scourge falling to 18. So it's on to Dan again to now respond to this and find an answer. So there's that turn 2 Stony Silence that we're talking about. That is a huge draw for Dan. Turns off a large chunk of Chris's deck. However, it turns off some of the most important cards in things like Arcbound Ravager, Cranial Plating, Darksteel Citadels, even Spellskite. So lots of good cards it turns off here. There we see an Inquisition Kozilek, and in his hand we see Etched Champion and Double Ravager. Dan instantly takes away that Etched Champion. Again, being the hardest card to answer is one thing. However, the 2 Arcbound Ravagers don't do anything. They're just 1/1s for 2. They will die and give something else to counter, which is fine, but they have to die naturally, which is the issue now. So, and not as common for that to happen. So, another attack for 2. Chris is back to 20 thanks to that lifelink, and sure enough, just instantly slams the copy of Damnation he had in his opening hand. Not even a second question. He actually has a second copy in his hand. Dan is in a fantastic spot here. I'd be hard-pressed to see how Chris gets out of this situation. Only one card in hand. That's the card that Dan was aware of in the Arcbound Ravager. So we'll have to see what Chris can come up with here. There's a Path to Exile in Dan's hand, as well as another copy of Abrupt Decay. So Dan's hand is just all removal spells. He is very far in lead. All he needs to find now is an actual win condition, and he'll have somewhere to go from there. But at the moment, doesn't actually have a way to pressure Chris's life total, or anything for that matter. It's just an Arcbound Ravager right now. So Spellskite joining the board. Mox Opal, of course, does nothing thanks to that Stony Silence. And another attack for 1. Looks like Dan's end to 15 after fetching as well here. So, yeah. Even though Dan doesn't have anything to fight with, he's still in an amazing spot. So, let's say Dan drew another land for the turn, so kind of running at that same spot he was in game 1 where he's just drawing lands. However, again, with what he has in his hand, he's not really being pressured here. He's not in any sort of immediate danger in terms of his life total. He's just got a bunch of answers in his hand. Dan sacrifices his fetch land after taking the 1 from the Arcbound Ravager again. Chris did deploy a second creature with actual attack in the form of Vault Scourge number 2. Again, and the problem here is once Chris gets to a critical mass that Dan feels he has to answer, he just pulls the trigger on his second copy of Damnation, and Chris is in a bad spot again. The Inkmoth Nexuses do still work. They are still able to be turned on. They're not artifacts until they turn on, of course. So he's not totally at a loss for creatures if Dan does Damnation again, but it's a very slow grind when you have to attack across 10 turns and your opponent plays a card like Lingering Souls, which just effectively answers Inkmoth Nexus on its own. So okay, it looks like Dan's reached that point where he has decided that it's time to Damnation again. Away goes Chris's board. Now, I believe that's all the copies that Dan does have in his sideboard. So he is now out of those damnations. So if Chris is able to again make a large board appear, it will stay, which is pretty important to note. So it looks like that was one infect there for Dan. So Chris has decided he'll go on the other route and try and do it manually instead with this 10-turn clock. Inquisition takes care of Master of Ethereum, leaving Chris with a cranial plating, if I'm not mistaken. Shambling Vent gets turned on. Chris going to take a read. Make sure he knows what it does. It is a 2-3 with lifelink. So, going to gain back some of his life. A Darksteel Citadel from Chris. Another attack. Scavenging Ooze. Another attack from the Inkmoth Nexus puts Dan to 3 poison. Looks like Dan is going to eat some creatures out of Chris's graveyard. I don't think he really cares which ones. Just any 2 creatures will do. I'll gain 2 life and I'll get 2 counters. I think if I'm in Chris's seat, I've probably changed gears and I'm just focusing on Inkmoth Nexus now. However, Dan's going to make that as difficult as possible. He's going to just make sure that he, hits harder than 1 a turn, which right now is all Chris can do, unfortunately. So. Goyf is a 5/6 and he attacked for 6 damage, so Chris does fall to 10. There's an Ornithopter, another poison to Dan, so Dan is up to 4. Chris is almost halfway. Again, this is, unfortunately for Chris, just a long grind when you're forced to deal 1 a turn. And it looks like, that's all that's going to be there. So Dan, provides Chris and says, I've got enough damage. You're just going to die here. Chris does agree, scoops him up. And they are off to a game 3. So should be an interesting one. Again, Affinity gets to go on the play here, which is very important for it, of course. But Dan, of course, being on Abzan, also has a lot of target removal spells. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what happens here. Because if Chris has to mulligan or something like that, or Dan has to mulligan, that can totally change the game. So we'll have to see exactly what Dan and Chris can come up with here. So no sideboard changes to be had here. Just gonna go right back into the action here. So a Mox Opal, an Ornithopter, an Inkmoth Nexus, a Signal Pest, and that's where Chris stops. So pretty strong turn 1. Dan, unfortunately, nothing to do turn 1 himself. Just has an Overgrown Tomb tapped and passes back. Does again have a copy of Damnation, however. Chris is instantly putting on the pressure with this Inkmoth Nexus, attacking for 2 poison immediately, as well as 1 regular damage thanks to the Ornithopter and Signal Pest combo. There is a Plains, and there it is again, another Stony Silence. Chris has Spell Pierce this time, however, so did bring it in from the sideboard. Very important as it does stop the Silence coming into play and essentially taking away 2 of Chris's mana. Now, I think Dan has 1 more land in hand, but I think that's all he has. And if that's the case, he needs to find a fourth land, or he's going to be not able to cast Damnation, which would be not ideal, of course. So Chris, thinking over what he wants to do here, may have one of his bigger 3-drops in hand. Again, things like his Master of Ethereums or his Etched Champions, very, very good. However, that would be his entire turn. Looks like he goes for a Signal Pest number 2, which is very good. And attacks again, same as last time. 1 regular damage, 2 infect. Dan draws a path to exile, which is important. Providing him a way to actually deal with at least one of the creatures. More than likely, I would use that for the Inkmoth Nexus, as that is the hardest one for him to answer. Seeing as how it is, in fact, a land most of the time. Well, all the time, but... So Dan goes ahead, plays out the Overgrown Tomb, untapped, taking 2 damage. This is a good draw. He has found a Lingering Souls for himself, so that is very important, as it will ensure that he is not, essentially just dead here. There's a Cranial Plating, though, for Chris. That's going to be a big bolster, of course, of the board. Dan does block. Dan did find his 4th land, so that is huge. Looks like he's not going to go for the Damnation just yet, which I think is fine. I think he wants to path this Inkmoth Nexus first to make sure it's dealt with, and then I think he wants to follow up with Damnation. So unfortunately, Chris is not giving that opportunity. He's not getting rid of that. He's not turning on the Nexus quite yet. Yeah, Dan just instantly blocks the Ornithopter. Not even a second guess. So I believe Chris only has 1 card in hand, which is very important, because Dan can just pull a trigger on his Damnation anytime he wants, and then Chris is in that awkward spot. So we'll have to see what Dan decides to do on this turn. And thinking over his options, gets a basic force off the Verdant Catacombs. Arcbound Ravager is handled nicely by Damnation, seeing as how Chris isn't able to keep anything alive through it, so the modular does not matter. If he does Damnation here, the The Opal is still active. It does still make mana, and of course he is able to turn on Inkmoth to provide the third artifact if need be. But Darksteel Citadel plus Opal plus Plating is the 3 it needs. An attack like this signifies to me that it is indeed going to be a Damnation turn, and there it is for sure. Chris has fallen to 19, and the board is now clear. Chris has a card in hand, but nothing with no mana open. There's no answer to this. Yeah, so Chris untaps. His board is just gone. Does still, of course, have the Inkmoth Nexus. So he is still able to hit Dan for this turning it in for 5 poison. So I think it's the options to go. Yep. I click the Plating. 4 artifacts plus the Inkmoth's initial power. Take 5 poison. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. So Dan is up to 9 poison. So the path to exile, of course, that we know he has in his hand is going to be the answer to that. Chris may think he just has him next turn. As long as Dan... Now, if Chris has his second copy of Spell Pierce, it's going to be game over. Okay, Thoughtseize first. And that's going to be the game. I think Dan only has the 1 removal spell in hand to deal with this Inkmoth Nexus. And Chris is going to take it with Thoughtseize. Yeah, no, Dan, I mean, unless Chris decides I'll take something else. Yeah, Chris just said I'll take Thoughtseize, or I'll take Path to Exile. I'll attack you with my Inkmoth Nexus. You take 10 poisons there. Good game. So,